we're talking about the NT wife and the ASD husband in this group. And so I want to talk briefly about when you guys are trying to problem solve a relationship issue. She will tend to look largely through the lens of emotion, which that's how she's wired. There's nothing wrong with that. He will tend to look through the lens of logic mostly when he's trying to figure things out and problem solve. That's the way he's wired. Nothing wrong with that. I do want to argue against trying to be logical when both parties are somewhat upset, and certainly when they're majorly upset, because it's not going to work. So sometimes the advice to be logical, let's be rational. That's impossible until you wind down. It doesn't work to try to be rational in the heat of the moment, trying to sort through and analyze the relationship difficulties and trying to stay logical. Well, I can promise you it hasn't worked. And the most logical thing to do is when you're overwhelmed, just allow yourself to feel whatever it is that you feel, and don't try to brainstorm your way out of it. Don't be logical in those moments. If you try to be logical, how you feel will kind of be the premise for your logical argument. And how you feel in that moment is not representative of how the relationship goes in its entirety. You then logically take those feelings and reach conclusions, right? You take your uncomfortable emotions and try to reach conclusions when you're trying to be logical. And that's not the kind of emotion-free reasoning that I'm suggesting. So instead, make the logical choice to not try logic when you're emotionally overwhelmed. Instead, let yourself feel what it is, let time pass. When you're cool-headed again, then the two of you can and should try to remove emotions from the equation, mostly, not entirely. That would be impossible. You do need, and I'm talking about the neurodiverse couples here, as much as this might be a turnoff to the NT wife, when you come back and everybody's calmed down, you're going to have to treat it like a business meeting. If you want to get it anywhere with him, you're going to have to pretend like he's a coworker and that you are in the boardroom and now going to conduct a business meeting. Using faulty emotional logic would only serve to strengthen your belief in your irrational views. When you're calm and you want to problem solve, let's shoot for 80% logic, 20% feelings. And in an ideal world, you wouldn't try to problem solve when you're upset anyway, because now both people are by default, especially him if he's bordering on a meltdown, totally irrational. And they'll come up with some ideas to problem solve, which they think are rational, but they're totally irrational and they're laden with emotional background. Both parties have flashed back because at this point, you've argued for how many years? 5, 10, 15, 20, 30. And so each argument weighs more than the ones that you had 10 years ago, because each argument, there's a cumulative effect. Even though the argument technically might be on a scale of 1 to 10 of 4 level of severity, it feels like a 9 because it's on the back of all the other arguments that didn't get resolved. Let's imagine that you got shipwrecked on a remote island and it was just you and this other lady. And she speaks Chinese and you speak Russian, okay? And neither one of you know the other language, but you know enough of how Chinese sounds that you know she's speaking Chinese, you just not sure what she's saying. She knows enough about how Russian sounds that she knows you're speaking Russian, but she doesn't understand what you're saying. What would you do in that situation? Probably would be using some version of rudimentary sign language. You would be pointing to things and you would be using your particular language as you're pointing to things or whatever. So there would be a huge visual component. And also, as both parties are kind of pointing and demonstrating physically with their arms and whatnot, they're speaking their language, and so the other person kind of gets some idea of what a particular word is based on what you're pointing to or whatever. For example, let's say that you can see over in the distance that there's a thunderstorm coming, really super dark clouds and lightning, and you look to this lady that speaks Chinese and you point, and you're talking and demonstrating. See, thunder, lightning, you and me probably need to find cover over there. And so you're speaking Russian as you're using sign language, so to speak, and she kind of gets it. So the whole point to this is, I'm going to make up a term, logic, I'm going to call it logic-ese. She operates mostly through the emotional lens. We're going to call it emotion-ese. You're stuck with somebody who speaks almost only emotion-ese, and you're a person who speaks almost only logic-ese. And so the two of you are not speaking the same language, and she doesn't get you. She expects you to get her, doesn't she? You're supposed to know what I want. You're supposed to know how to behave. You're supposed to know what I'm feeling and why. You're supposed to be able to read my mind and my emotions. I know I'm being sarcastic, but not much. She doesn't get you either. She doesn't get your logic. She doesn't get your why you think the way you do, why you feel the way you do, why you behave the way you do, why you have certain opinions. The moral to the story is this. That's why a long way around the bush to get to this point. One of the things that you can do if you're so inclined, and you have compassion, you have empathy, don't let anybody tell you otherwise. You can think in terms of, okay, I'm with a lady that speaks emotion-ese, and she has very little clue about me and how I operate. And so instead of getting upset with her like she has done with me, how many times? Lost count. I'm going to muster up a little grace and mercy, compassion, patience in that moment and realize she just doesn't speak my language. And I'm going to work really hard at not getting angry with her for not speaking my language. She's stuck in the language of emotion-ese. She's stuck there. She can't crawl out of her skin and crawl into your skin and look out of your eyeballs and use your brain. She doesn't have much of a clue about you, and she will never have much of a clue about you. And that's not necessarily her fault, because you don't understand her either a lot of the time. Some things you do, of course. But there has been times where you think, God, she's so overly emotional and irrational, and why would she feel that way, and why would she want us to do that? So it's confusion, two-way street. It's a two-way street. And so the point is, again, in those moments where you're so frustrated with her, and especially when you're downloading her words and behavior as she's belittling you and being critical of you, try, guys, in those moments to be thinking, okay, here we go. Just like these Chinese and Russian people on the island, she's speaking emotion-ese, I'm speaking Russian. We're not going to have a meeting of the minds much here. We're very rarely on the same page. And so instead of me getting aggravated that she's not speaking my language, I'm just going to have some grace and mercy in that moment and realize she's speaking emotion-ese. She doesn't get me. I'm not going to allow myself to get bent out of shape given the dynamics here. When next time you're frustrated with your wife, look at her as a foreigner and who doesn't get you. And I think if you will do that, she won't push your buttons as bad. We want to think in terms of grace and mercy. That's the big message here. She's downloading things a particular way. You're not causing her download. You're not responsible for how she's downloading things. She's choosing her download, and then she is feeling based on the download a particular way, and she's saying and behaving particular ways based on how she feels. So I'm going to have a little grace and mercy and realize I don't have any control over that. It's a shame that she is so miserable. I'm going to take the high road here and realize, I would hate to be her, where I'm always suffering so much in this way. So instead of me getting defensive or trying to explain myself or trying to go head to head with her or feeling criticized, instead I'm going to choose grace and mercy. This is for your benefit, grace and mercy. Grace and mercy, that's your new mantra, grace and mercy. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to extend a little mercy in this situation when she gets done talking, which is I'm going to avoid getting defensive and getting angry back and explaining and then ridiculing her. So that's what she's doing to me right now. I'm listening to it as I see her, and I'm not going to do the same thing to her. That's mercy in the moment. Mercy in the moment. You're going to realize I don't need to be taking this behavior as personally like she's been doing. She has taken my autistic traits personally. She's so locked into the emotional brain that it's hard for her to muster up logic. Not that she doesn't have any logic, but she basically, when she's upset, she doesn't have any logic. And so she has her own mind blindness too. That's how she's wired. And I'm not going to take it personally anymore. She can't help her wiring any more than I can help my wiring. So I'm not going to participate in this game of who should change their wiring first. It's not going to happen. She's not going to change mine. I can't change her. I give up. I'm no longer going to try to explain or correct her or get her to understand my perspective. I have no control over it. Grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change. She cannot wrap her brain around the belief systems that you have, the way that you think, the way that you feel, or the fact that you lack displayed emotion, the way that you behave, your logic. She doesn't get it. That's the NT version of mind blindness. You're doing things that she is downloading as inappropriate, and that's what's causing the pain. Resentment is very common. I talk about it all the time. The antidote is forgiveness. And forgiveness is this, and this only. I'm going to stop replaying this movie in my head, or actually movies, or another way of putting it, I'm going to stop recounting these events that have been so troublesome in the past. I'm going to no longer think about my past hurts. I'm not trying to sweep them under the rug. It did hurt. I have a right to be resentful, but my resentment is only hurting me. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to let go of resentment for my benefit, not for his. I'm going to stop reminding myself of all of these past events that were so hurtful for my benefit, not his. When you start to ruminate or replay the event, which you will, you don't beat up on yourself and go, and something you might be there might have been several minutes go by when you were contemplating and ruminating, I can't believe he said this, I can't believe he did this, why do I have to live like this? And then you go, oh, wait a minute, wait. There, I did it again. I was in the rabbit hole with my negative thoughts. You don't beat up on yourself about it. You go, well, I've practiced ruminating for years, so now and it's a habit. I'm going to have to develop a new habit of practicing that as soon as a thought comes in my head where I'm wanting to replay this movie, I'm instantly going to go, okay, wait a minute. We don't want to hash through that again because it's making me suffer. In theory, it's as easy as eating a piece of candy. But where it gets real difficult is you're going to have to catch yourself repeating the old habit and forgive yourself for doing that. Or I should say maybe don't beat up on yourself for relapsing. And you're going to have to be real consistent and practicing. It's going to take months. So that's the hard part, is retraining my mind to catch these negative thoughts. And okay, well, there was one. I don't know what popped in my head, but I just reminded me of this thing he said yesterday or last week. And I'm not going to finish that movie. I started the movie and I used to sit there for the entire thing. Now the movie starts, I'm leaving the theater instantly. And then you distract yourself, you move on to whatever you're doing. This will happen a dozen times a day. I would ask you to stop with the thoughts of, oh, well, he can't help it. This is part of the disorder. I'd rather you have that thought than to not have that thought. But whenever you have that thought, well, it's not his fault. He has this disorder, and this is just what I'm going to have to live with. You're feeding your resentment again. Don't try to make sense of it. Just that when you would ordinarily have the thought, oh, here it goes again, but he can't help it. But wait a minute. That's playing the movie again. I'm not going to try to make sense of it. I'm not going to try to explain it away. I'm not going to try to get him off the hook and just chalk it up to, no, I'm not doing I'm not playing this game anymore. I'm out. Catch yourself thinking about him and shift.
So one of the things that's prominent in ASD is this business of problem with prediction. Another way of stating that is an inability to notice cause and effect, but I'm exclusively referring to social and emotional situations. The person with ASD can certainly predict things and understand cause and effect in the non-social arena, but has more difficulty when there are emotional and social nuances involved. And again, this is all in the context of social and emotional situations. When I say or do X, my spouse tends to feel Y. And when my spouse feels that particular way, I can do Z to help the situation. So we can see that that is the prediction there. My spouse will tend to feel a particular way based on my behavior. And the prediction there is what I can do that will likely help the situation. So what I say or do results in a particular feeling. And then when that particular feeling has manifest and I can do a form of a remedy, that's all cause and effect. Now, sometimes it's not a direct cause, it's more of a correlation. In other words, A didn't necessarily cause B, but there was certainly a correlation. And this is all a result of the business of emotions blindness, which is alexithymia, and mind blindness. In a social and emotional situation, I can predict what the result is. And if I want to avoid that result in the future, I can say and do other things instead. So that business of prediction in the emotional, social arena is difficult for people on the autism spectrum, which may explain why sometimes your ASD spouse seems very insensitive, uncaring, selfish, and perhaps even narcissistic.
One of the strengths, assuming he does have ASD level 1, that come with the package is he will tend to think critically. He has high expectancies in a very small number of interests. He is, and I could go into why this happens, but he's also very self-critical, usually because he was on the receiving end of a lot of unacceptance and disapproval growing up. He also tends to evaluate others based on his filter. The problem that it creates for you, though, is can be very critical. He's self-critical. We mentioned that. But now, when you do something to yourself, you're in a much better position to do it to other people. So he can be very critical of you and intolerant of you. And it's very common for guys on the autism spectrum to be a little on the OCD side, the perfectionistic side. I'm not necessarily saying full-blown obsessive-compulsive disorder, but most of them, at least in certain areas of life, are very perfectionistic. Another strength would be most of them have a very large vocabulary, usually within their field of interest, and they tend to have a very in-depth knowledge base, usually in one specific area. That's good. We wouldn't have the programmable computer right here if that hadn't happened. The problems that you run into based on that strength, though, is he will often use words to escape or avoid situations. He'll try to out-logicize you. I'm just making that term up. In his mind, he will view you as overly emotional and irrational, and you lose all credibility with him when you get emotional while you're trying to talk to him. The other thing that will happen based on the strengths of having a huge vocabulary and having a high IQ and having a lot of information in one area is that he will become easily and severely bored doing things outside of that area. And you may view him as someone who is very rigid and one-track mind and self-absorbed and a know-it-all, which is totally understandable. Another strength would be he can hyper-focus on his special interests for extended periods of time. Very intense concentration, long attention span in his area of interest. And he will be very goal-directed, very task-oriented, very persistent. Those are all good, except maybe with his significant other. The problems that you're going to run into and probably have based on those strengths is he's going to resist interruption. He's going to hate change, especially surprise change. He's going to forget or totally neglect some of the things that you want him to do. And he may even avoid you during his period of being hyper-focused on something over there. And you may view him as being very stubborn, and that would be understandable. Another strength would be he has a very inquisitive attitude, usually about the things in his special interest area or related. So it's very typical for, in this case, the guy with ASD level 1 to have a lot of intellectual curiosity. He will have intrinsic motivation. He won't really be motivated by outside forces. It's an internal thing. Sounds good, but the problems that arise is he may ask embarrassing questions. When you're trying to deliver a good message, you may feel like he's, instead of listening to you, he's just put you on the witness stand and interrogating you based on, what you're trying to say. You may view him as being someone who's resisting your input or your opinion or your perspective or your constructive criticism and so on. Another strength would be he is very autonomous. And he learned that again from childhood. I can't fit in with the team. I'm not a team player. I'm not good at socializing, and so I'm just going to go solo. And he's very independent and prefers individualized work and prefers work of a non-social nature, doesn't he? He's very reliant on self. Self-reliance, that's a great thing, isn't it? Well, some of the things that you may run into is he rejects your input. When you need him to be a team player, a lot of times he doesn't see the value in that. Another strength is he will tend to be high energy through the day. I'll just make up a scenario that'll help you wrap your brain around. He will be high energy at work. This is just one example of many. He will burn up so much energy at work that when he gets home, he has nothing left. So when when you use your mind, thinking and problem solving and working and reading and looking at facts, figures, objects, and that burns up a lot of energy. Your brain burns up a lot of energy when you're concentrating for extended periods of time, which he does very well. Only problem is he's burned up so much energy doing his special interests, in this example at work, he's got nothing left. He comes home and he's burnt out, and he has to do some version of de-escalation at that point. But with this business of having high energy, he will be very frustrated with inactivity. His mind is always racing. He would say if he were here, yeah, my mind is always racing and it has to be racing. Boredom is excruciating to me. And to just sit down and do nothing or engage in idle chit-chat with my wife is almost painful. It's because he needs constant stimulation, especially of a visual nature. Especially of a visual nature. And so you may view him as someone who's hyperactive and can never just sit down and relax and just be still and be quiet. Another strength is he enjoys organizing things in his head, and he may even enjoy organizing material things. And he probably at some level has tried to organize you to squeeze into his routine and structure. He is very good at systematizing. In other words, looking for patterns and themes and systems. Sounds like a good strength, but the problem is he may come off as being very bossy, rude, domineering. He may construct very complicated rules or systems of a social nature that don't match up with yours. He's going to have a lot of hidden rules in his head that he may not even be aware of at a conscious level, but if you violate any of those of his hidden rules, because he's big on rules, because he's big on structure, when you violate one of his rules, you'll know it. The last one is he has a great ability to conceptualize and to synthesize. He enjoys problem solving as long as it's not of a social or emotional nature, and he loves intellectual activity. Very high IQ, very high in logic. Sounds like a great strength. Problem you run into, though, is he's going to omit some certain details that are important to you. He may reject some details that were important to you. He may question your instruction or your directives or your opinion or your perspective because it doesn't match up with his ability to conceptualize. Because you're assuming you're talking to him about something in the way of problem solving in the marriage, it's hard for him to look through the lens of emotions as you do well, which is a great skill for you. He's only looking through the lens of logic. She wants this emotionality, for lack of a better term, from you because she has felt perhaps that you're just a little too logical and robotic. When you try to problem solve, you're coming at it through the filter of almost entirely logic, almost. When she's trying to problem solve, especially when she's upset while she's trying to problem solve, she's almost coming purely through the emotional lens. That's why the two of you can't get anything resolved. But if he can move a little left of far right and be a little more emotional, and in an ideal world, she would contain some of that emotion in the heat of the moment and be more inclined to appeal to your logic. Now, instead of being in two separate pages, we're starting to merge at least somewhat on the same page. And that's when you can actually resolve some stuff. And then you get this snowball effect going in the other direction. Instead of a downward spiral, now you get an upward spiral. Because, hey, you know what? In the last 2 weeks, I've noticed that we have solved 2 major problems. That if those 2 things had come up last year, it would have just created a 3rd problem. But we actually resolved, or that talk that we had last night. I know for a fact if we'd had that talk last year, that would have ended in a shit show. We actually had a decent conversation, and we were civil with one another. And so now trust starts to come back. Feeling safe in the relationship starts to come back. Now both parties are more motivated to do even better. It's reinforcing. Okay, if I did a little bit good with that one, then I know I have it, and I can do a little bit better with that same thing next time, and a little bit better after that. And then pretty soon we're both getting really good at talking about heavyweight things or difficult things that would ordinarily end badly. We can talk about most of them now. It's never going to be perfect, and we don't have to have it perfect. But our arguments are occurring less frequently, and even when they do occur, they're less intense. Now you're getting somewhere.
So when you enter a neurodiverse relationship and then on to the neurodiverse marriage, it's a lot like a boxing match and getting in the boxing ring. Some people play by a different set of rules. They may butt heads, they may knee you in the groin, they may step on your foot. So some people are going to abide by the standard boxing rules and some are not. They might hit below the belt, they might push you into the ropes, all kinds of things. And you have to know that this is just human nature. It's not just the experience that you're having in a neurodiverse marriage. If you think broadly, you run into people who don't play by the rules in general. If you're walking down the street and you trip over a rock, you don't get angry at the rock. So people are a lot like rocks that get in your way. They are, in a sense, obstacles from time to time for you. They have their own nature, and that nature isn't yours, and it's going to clash with you sometimes, and that's just what it means to be a human in general, but you may experience this to a larger degree in the neurodiverse marriage. So are you going to complain that people have a nature where they have an ego, or they can be passive-aggressive, or they cannot play by the rules, or they have weak moments and, quote, misbehave, unquote? And then in your constant complaining, you put yourself in a chronic disadvantage because you're draining yourself of a lot of energy that could be better used for other things. You're draining yourself with all these useless negative emotions, and you're not playing proper defense against your opponent, if we want to run with this boxing analogy, because you're all consumed with this kind of personalizing the situation, that this person shouldn't be doing these things, they shouldn't be hitting me, they shouldn't be getting in my way, they shouldn't be trying to defend themselves, they shouldn't be engaged in self-preservation, they shouldn't have their own fears and worries and anxieties. So instead, you have to create some distance between you and your opponent. And you have to do that in a very smart and intelligent way. That's called healthy emotional detachment. Not just your neurodiverse marriage, but other people in general. They're going to play a little dirty from time to time, and they're going to hit you, and it's going to hurt. But you don't whine and complain. You just figure out how you're going to defend yourself better. And one of the ways you defend yourself is not necessarily to hit back, but not make yourself vulnerable by putting yourself in harm's way time and time again. Or having very mature and convincing arguments that influence the other person to perhaps change their behavior.